It's always a pleasure to see you all, and especially today to focus on open data, which is a very timely subject because in many parts of the world there are open data celebrations, whether it's Open Data Week, Open Data Day, and that's why we thought it would be a good idea to have this fireside chat focused on open data. Now, obviously, open data has been around for a while. There is some kind of discussion in the community when it started, because there was first freedom of information, then you had open science, you had open source, you had a variety of efforts in order to make particular kinds of data like geospatial data open. But I think ultimately it was around 2008, 2010 that open government data definitely took off. And since then, of course, we've seen a lot of evolution. And that's what we will talk about today with two amazing panelists who have been in this space for quite a while and are also at the same time planning out the future, which is why today's session is called Looking Back to the Future, where we're gonna try to draw some lessons from what have we seen the last kind of 15 years or more, but also what kind of future do we want and what do we expect will happen. And so I do want to start with perhaps a little bit kind of looking back, but also kind of a evaluation. And so one could argue that anyway, we are kind of moving from an open data utopia where we really thought that open data would make massive change in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, but also be a force for innovation. And while that has been true in many ways, we also can, I think, probably reflect that we are moving into more of kind of open data pragmatism, where we really start to think about, well, it's anyway, there are some conditions that explain whether or not open data will be successful. And so eager to hear, perhaps starting with you, Nati, what have been some of the kind of the biggest lessons of the last, let's say, 15 years?
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you very much for the invitation to the data and policy team. I'm really glad to be here and share just a couple of ideas and of course also some questions, because while doing the kind of the talking points for this, I also have some questions for the audience and for the rest of the participants. As far as what we've learned, so as I was just saying, the Open Data Charter is turning 10 this year. I've been around for a little bit more than that, but one of the things that I think I would start with is, of course, everybody in the open data world already knows that the shift of the open data policies from publish and they will come to publish with a purpose. I think that was a major change in the open data community, if you will. That it goes from the very beginning of the open data policies, where governments were just kind of trying to be cool and go with what was going on worldwide and trying to create open data portals and publish whatever they could without kind of a thinking of open data as a means towards an end, but rather as an end on itself. So it was, let's publish. We'll publish and they will come. They will come and reuse it. Who? We don't know. For what? We don't know. What was the purpose behind that? And of course, what we saw was the proliferation of a lot of open data portals around the world, because that was like everywhere. We saw a lot of open government partnership commitments on open data, but as I said, open data was the end and not the means towards something else. So the reuse aspect of it wasn't as core as it turned out to be. And we learned the hard way, because we saw a lot of open data policies kind of being turned down or dimmed down because they weren't fulfilling anybody's purposes, not the politicians, not the technical community. And that's when we started the discussion on publish with a purpose, like what are we doing wrong? And of course, it seems so obvious right now, but it didn't back then, that we needed to focus first on asking the questions. You've done a lot of work on this, Stefan, but asking the questions, trying to understand the problem, and then design an open data policy that could accompany and be helpful towards the end of solving the problem that we found together. So I think that's one of the major lessons. Let's start with the questions. Let's start with the problems. As I say, from now, like looking it back from now, it seems super obvious. It wasn't that obvious by then. One of the other lessons that I think we are just getting to talk from the open data community, and I think we need to double click on that and make a big push, is if we see kind of in a parallel and super stretched kind of vision. We were working, like the open data community was kind of working at the same time as the data privacy community was working. But the privacy community was actually working on regulations before implementation. Like, and once again, I'm doing like a super overstretching, but regulations on privacy came way before regulations on data, or even, for example, in Latin America, even before access to information, you could say. So kind of the non-digital agenda. And that actually allowed them, once governments changing in administrations and maybe privacy not being the best, the core theme for that government, they actually having regulations in place allowed them to be stronger in advocacy and trying to push back on privacy. The open data community was first focused on implementation and not so much on regulation. And so once the open data portals are starting to be rolled back, and we are seeing that also right now, there is no legal background for us to go to courts and fight back. And so that's a major lesson. And I think now data governance is part of a major conversation. And there's a lot of regulations being put in place, but it took like 10 years or 12 years for us to be, meaning the open data community, talking about that broadly. So I think that's also a big lesson, and I think we're still learning. And that's why I think this is an ongoing conversation right now, and it's not just about open data, it's about data. I would think those are two major things. And the third one that I would say it's a big lesson is the way that the open data community and the work and the policies started to go into thematic conversations, which actually allowed for a more in-depth conversation, for a more in-depth work, and actually broaden the scope of the conversation, because thematic organizations, universities, journalists, other civil society organizations that didn't see themselves as open data, but they were kind of thematically working, were able to join the conversation, or we were able to join them, whatever, however you see them, but we were able to broaden the conversation about data once we kind of the open data policies is starting to go thematically. And I think that's very important, and I'm still seeing that, and I do think it's a positive outcome of all the years of implementing open data policies. And I'm going to leave it there with those 3 points.
So, Anastasia, any additional lessons from your end that you've seen? Because you enter it sometimes from a different, more information systems perspective, and so eager to see whether you have other lessons that you would like to add here.
First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on the time zone you are located. And it is my pleasure to be here. And yeah, with regards to the response of Nati, it is difficult to argue with anything and add on the top. Whereas I would probably start with indeed agreeing with Stefan also that while we had some expectations as regards open data, it is not to say that we have not fulfilled them, because our initial idea was that they will serve the purpose of transparency, innovation, economic opportunity, and we have observed some evidence that it is indeed the case. Perhaps not to the extent we have expected this, but nevertheless, because also during those open data days in Luxembourg, which took place just a couple of days back, where together with Stefan we have been attendees and speakers, there were very many evidences presented. And today I would say that actually open data perhaps is of even of a bit more importance, because we are currently in an era of disinformation, misinformation, and open data, in addition to those basic needs we initially assigned it to, actually can serve also as a sort of fact-checking, etc. Whereas at the same time, indeed, it is not as mature and as not to say useful, but rather adopted to the extent we have expected it at the very beginning. And from my perspective, it is first of all due to the moment at which governments, national or subnational or regional, have adopted open data initiative per se, because those who have been rather early adopters, I would say that still within those regions, within those areas, open data is still a bit more alive concept, which has some interest around. And my personal feeling is that it is the case for Spain, for France, to Latvia to a certain extent, because originally I'm Latvian, and I know this from experience of mine, that although we have not been very, very early adopters, but nevertheless, we did it very timely, particularly comparing to Estonia, in which I'm located at the moment. And whereas if we take a look on those open data maturity reports at the moment, Estonia is very well assessed and is considered to be really the trendsetter, whereas Latvia is not anymore so very advanced, whereas a couple of years back it was vice versa. Estonia, regardless of the development of the overall digital government, has been poorly assessed in those maturity reports, but at the very same time from those stakeholders and actors within this open data ecosystem of both nations, I can observe that in Latvia, although from report it doesn't follow that we are very successful, but at the very same time in community open data is of interest. We do have those continuous hackathons, we do produce solutions based on those open data and etc. There is some interest around this data, whereas in Estonia there are very many pushes by the government at the moment in order to really to promote open data, in order to bring it on the new level, in order to also to affect those high value data sets definitions, because for instance language data, which has been recently added as one of the categories, as far as I know from Estonian government, it was our push to European Union and European Commission that we have to expand this set of high value data sets towards including this language data. But nevertheless, in both in academia and in society, in businesses, I do see a very expressed reluctance towards open data. There is a very little value seen in this open data, and from my perspective it is due to the moment where this open data initiative has been adopted. So when it was a sort of the rise of open data and everyone wanted to experiment with it, Estonia have not been in there yet, and as such this interest has passed us to a certain extent. So this would be the very first thing. I would say, first of all, these early adopters are now in a bit more competitive position, and of course it is not only about where it has been adopted, but also whereas those efforts have been continuous. So whereas now these efforts are indeed continuous or not, because in Latvia, for instance, there are some advances, but not so very expressive as it has been in the past, and perhaps there is some certain decline in the interest around it. Secondly, I would say that it is a little progress overall which has been made around open data, because at the very beginning when open data just arose, we were talking about how important it is to make this data interoperable in order to make this use meaningful, whereas we are still in the same position. I would say that we are still talking that interoperability is very important, whereas in the vast majority of cases we still do talk and do see, we do talk about interoperability, whereas we do see standalone data sets, and now there are some advances in this regards, whereas it is almost 2 decades of open data initiative existing. It is not only about interoperability, I would say, but it is also about other sort of the progress we are making or we are not making around open data, such as those pushes towards purposeful data opening, as implies from the 3rd and 4th wave, which also Nati has mentioned, and Stefan has wrote extensively and actually introduced those different waves of open data. It is also about data quality in AI readiness of the data, which is pushed today, whereas in fact it is not due to generative AI. It has been very relevant even 10 years back, because artificial intelligence is here for decades, and this always has been very crucial to have this data qualitative, to have this data meaningful, to have this data that we are indeed interested to use, so to have those high value data sets, to have this data to be AI ready, because it is now not about generative AI ready data, but rather AI ready data, whereas we are talking about this only today. And this could affect, of course, also the adoption of open data before, when there was a certain interest to play around with open data, whereas upon use usage, it was revealed that data quality is insufficient, because in open data domain, data quality is understood to be differently from the data quality management domain, because I personally come from data quality management domain, and it is significantly more complex and multidimensional concept compared to what we do treat data quality to be in open data, where it is merely about metadata, to have this metadata, to have it more or less complete, to have it more or less accurate, and we typically do not talk even about the content of the data set itself. So what about the content? Yes, they have some accompanying documentation, but at the very same time, it is just to understand the data. And I assume that these and many more challenges, but I don't want to take the whole hour to talk about this, tempered this early optimism we had. So actually, I would say that it is not about us being too idealistic at the very beginning, but rather about us being too little pragmatic and too little practical around open data, which has prevented us from leveraging all those associated benefits expected to be surrounding open data. So this would be my 2 cents.
Thanks so much. And yeah, it reminds me also exactly last week at the Open Data Days at the European Union Open Data Days in Luxembourg, there was a lot of focus on quality of the metadata, but exactly ultimately the data set matters, if not more, as much, and quite often that's kind of skipped, right? And that's a whole different discussion. Exactly, it has been there, but I would argue that perhaps, anyway, Gen AI has made it even more pronounced, the importance of actually data quality, because suddenly, anyway, they start thinking about, anyway, how can we start using open data for Gen AI? And that's where I want to go next, because obviously AI is now kind of the name and the phenomenon of our days. And so one question for both of you is, given the fact that when we talked about open data in the past, we mainly talked about kind of tabular data, right? So data that was collected in some kind of a structured fashion. And given the fact that Gen AI, and especially large language models, of course, because anyway, the term already says it, right? So it's about large language models, has basically pushed us to think about a broader concept of data. So the question for both of you is that, do we also need to start thinking about a broader definition of open data that goes beyond structured tabular data, but also might include audio, video, even three-dimensional kind of data as well? And so, Nati, over to you. Do you see this happening?
So I'll start with one of the questions that I kind of had in my mind when I was preparing for this session, which is I don't have a proper answer, but you know, the Open Data Charter is both a natural charter with the 6 principles, and then the institution that helps promote those principles. And those principles are already 10 years old. So I was looking into the principles, like the deep dive explanation of the principles, and I was thinking if we need to maybe revise the principles to add more words, more wording, a stronger wording on kind of the ethical aspect that everybody's discussing now because of these types of questions, which I think is very healthy. The ethical aspect of data collecting, sharing, and use, because the Open Data Charter works on promoting governmental open data, so it's citizens' data. And then should we double click a little bit more on that? And as I was saying, data governance is now part of the bigger conversation, but it wasn't that big of a deal when we first started with open data. It was just like, let's get this going. Of course, there are frameworks and everything, but you know, this double click might be needed. I don't know. We have a board call later today. I'll check in with the board.
This is planning for the board here.
Yeah, but I do think there's something there because of course things have changed. I don't think that synthetic data will kind of change the need for open governmental data. When I speak about open data, I'm talking about governmental data. But we do need, as Anastasia was saying, we do need to check and be focused on the quality of the data and the metadata, and in order for the data to be AI ready. And that wasn't the purpose of open data at its beginnings, of course, because AI, like it's been around for a long time, but it's been on the focus on the kind of high levels of conversation, not for so long. So I do think we need to double click on that, and I do think that we will find spaces, and that is actually what is happening right now, where synthetic data is the way to go, because you're actually privacy is prevailing there, and as I said, open governmental data is citizens data. So we need to be able to, of course, try to provide better services from the government perspective, but we need to be aware of the privacy and ethical questions that might arise. So I do think it's kind of complementary. I don't think one is going to replace the other. And as far as something that Anastasia was saying, like we've been talking about interoperability for a long time now. Having been a governmental official working on these topics, I know how hard it is to develop interoperability platforms. It's not easy at all to implement that, but it actually helps on the quality of open data, because if kind of the data is actually interoperable, it means that it's standardized, and standardization of data actually helps with data quality. And we have another big conversation in the digital world, not just about generative AI and AI itself, but also about DPIs, digital public infrastructure. And one of the main aspects, core aspects of DPIs is interoperability platforms. So there's a big conversation there in the digital world around these two, like AI and DPIs. So I do think because of the interoperability conversation, there's a lot of knowledge coming from the open data community that we can actually help kind of implement those new DPIs and the interoperability platforms with all the lessons learned from the needs of open data policy. And I do think that there's maybe not such a big connection between the DPI conversation and the AI conversation, and it should be there because it will only add value to the conversation and to the implementation, which is the hard way. The hard problem there. I think I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, no, and again, anyway, we could unpack that for the next day or so, but I think very valuable points. And also, I think the whole review of the ethical aspect also deals with kind of the discussion in the Gen AI environment on whether open data leads to extractive behavior, right? Where actually data is being extracted for purposes that were not initially intended or are only benefiting a few, not the kind of, which was the other view, of course, of the early open days, is that anyone would benefit equally, and it remains to be seen, right? But Anastasia, so yesterday I gave a presentation, and so exactly they asked this question to me. So will synthetic data replace the need for open data? Over to you. I'm not going to share what my answer was, but
yeah, actually, I would be very, very keen to know what your answer was. So shall we have a time? You're more than welcome to elaborate, and I'm pretty sure that everyone will be happy to know. My personal opinion that, of course, synthetic data is an important component of the future open or public data ecosystem, because I would be in favor of expanding the topic towards, the concept itself towards public data ecosystem due to various constraints, but I will try to stick to the question of yours and will not elaborate on the former parts. So, but at the very same time, so as you might know from our previous chats, I am very positive of synthetic data, but I do not consider that they will substitute open data. They will rather be a complementary element towards it, and we can see their value to be at least twofold. First of all, by means of having these synthetic data, we can enable public availability of the scarce or sensitive data, such as medical data, which otherwise cannot be made publicly available in the open data format, being compliant with all the open data principles. Of course, synthetic data per se is already a deviation from open data definition, because by definition, by those principles, these data should be published in the form they are stored in information systems, where synthetic data is indeed a very, very huge deviation. But anyways, other than that, I do see them to bring value in this area, as well as to complement, to augment those data we already have. Because for artificial intelligence models and generative AI models, not always those data sets available as open data are sufficient in order to train the model. And as such, we do observe in very many cases that this open data is rather just a complementary source to the data we do possess ourselves in our information systems. Whereas synthetic data might be a step further, because when we have this open data complementary to our data, it is still about the challenge on how to put them together. And whereas we can do this at all, whereas structures are compatible and etc. Whereas for synthetic data, it is just about maturing and increasing in depth the data set in question. And as such, this could allow us potentially to really to make this data a bit more suited towards AI models and generative AI in general. Whereas at the same time, it is not to forget about very many limitations and challenges we have to count with when we talk about synthetic data, because synthetic data might even amplify those biases we typically do have in our data. Synthetic data should be generated very wisely and also tested, so that those, for instance, very rare real-world patterns we do observe and which are crucial for our AI model, that they are not ignored by synthetic data, because synthetic data generation process can overlook them as a sort of some sort of a bias it ignores. So actual synthetic data might also affect the quality of the data it will generate, and even more, synthetic data quality depends on the data quality of the original data set. So we come back to the topic we do reiterate all the time about the data governance and data quality. And yeah, with regards to data governance, because actually it will be not only about the data quality of the data set itself, but also about the surrounding this documentation around this data set. So AI readiness of the data set of various those biases were properly addressed and properly made known to the data user in question. Even more, the more we will rely on synthetic data. So if we do consider scenario when we do substitute open data, real world open data by synthetic data, we might end up in synthetic data loops, which can lead also to cascading distortion, to degraded model quality in question, etc. So while I do consider that synthetic data is the future in certain scenarios, such as those when we do have this limited data availability or rather limited opportunities to make it publicly available, it will not be something they substitute, but rather augment, to open those data and to augment those data which are valuable, which can be made open data, but they remain insufficient for training AI models. So this would be my view on this topic.
Yeah. And the last question, anyway, the topic of today is looking back to the future. I think we've looked back, we've taken stock of the present. So what does the future look like? And eager to hear from both of you, what should we aspire, let's say by 2035, as it relates to open data? I mean, what should we aspire and how do we get there? Anastasia, what do you think 2035 should look like in terms of open data? And then Nati, over to you, and then we open the floor for everyone.
Of course, it is rather difficult to predict, especially considering the current paradigm and those changes, which implies from very many contexts, including but not limited to technological advances. Because a couple of years back, we could not even imagine that generative AI will be there, will be here, and artificial intelligence will be so very democratized. Because in that time we were living in data democratization, not AI. Whereas now the shift towards the opposite took place. Considering the current trends, I would say that we will be making the ongoing shift towards more public data ecosystems rather than open data ecosystems, which supposes these changes in a couple of areas. First of all, I do believe that it will be concerning data publisher, so that it will not be only about public administrations and governments to make open data publicly available, which is not a mere surprise, because we currently already observe this, that more and more citizens are being involved in data sharing businesses, So basically that accompanying data governance models would be also expected to be changed from government to citizen, G2C, to B2G, B2C, C2G, etc. I also do believe that, of course, it will concern more and more structure of this data, because at the moment we live in belief. I would not say that it is a reality, but we are living in belief that open data is just about structured tabular data, whereas in very many cases it is no longer about the structured data. It is also about semi-structured and non-structured, unstructured data. So it also the reference to the question of Stefan before of various those other data objects would be also considered to be this open data, whereas open or public data, it is just a matter of the philosophy of various, not even philosophy, but rather wording of various. We do substitute open data by public data because we are already partially in there, but due to the use of this widely accepted term of open data, which is very closely associated with those principles, people who are not so very in the topic might assume that it is about structured, smaller data sets, whereas it is much broader. And of course, we will be moving there more and more, because it is, as also was confirmed during these open data days, it is very much also about language data at the moment, which of course is in very, very rarely cases can be considered to be structured data, etc. So data collection or data collector, structure, dynamism of the data, of course, because we also do live in the belief that it is about historical data predominantly, so some reports coming from governments from previous years, whereas in very many cases now it is already about the real-time data or nearly real-time data. And again, it was also somewhat confirmed by the colleagues of ours from European Commission, namely Georgia Lobos, the last week when they have talked about the stream data. So it will be also probably about the switch of what is being current paradigm of having this openly, publicly available, accessible data for everyone, towards a bit more inclusive paradigm where a bit different data ecosystems are also in there. And it is also what we have conceptualized together with colleagues of mine, that to fully leverage this data, of course, we can have a couple of separated concepts of open data and data spaces, or we can bring them together in public data ecosystem as something a bit more inclusive and something a bit more meaningful, and from what we can really derive this value. And as such, it will be also, it also means that it will affect a bit of whether these data are publicly available to everyone, or rather there are some sort of either contracts or some control conditions for some particular use cases, and etc. Of course, it will be also about this maturation of data ecosystem and all those running elements, so those meta attributes which characterize data ecosystems. So not only data, but also stakeholders, also processes, and many more things. I would not go into very many detail due to time constraints. So that and since it is a concept, since it is an ecosystem, so it is a systems theory view, then of course it will be again about governance. So governance will be seen at very multiple levels: data governance, AI governance, and also ecosystem governance. And in all the cases, it refers to different, but still a bit interrelated concepts. So if I have to keep it very, very short, this probably would be the view of mine.
Great. Thank you. Nati, short as well, if feasible, because anyway, the future can be many things, and it's not an easy ask. It's actually an ask that I typically kind of not really like, because it's very hard to do. But what do you think 2035 might look like, or what should it look like?
We should regroup in 10 years time to see if what we say now makes any sense. But looking at it from now, you know, we work mostly in the kind of global majority, and so what we're seeing there, and I think will have an impact in 10 years, is kind of two velocities at the same time. So there's in governments and national governments, but also subnational governments, first just getting started with their open data policies, like we're talking about setting up their first portals, talking about internal data governance, doing all the what we call in the open data community kind of the evangelization of all the civil servants. So we are seeing that happening right now as we are speaking. And also, of course, the development of AI systems and implementation of AI systems from the governmental perspective, but also the private sector, academia, etc. I do think that will have an impact. So maybe in 10 years' time, in some areas of the world, we will be where we are right now in kind of in Europe, for example. You know, so it's also understanding that there's different paces in different areas of the world. What we will definitely see is stronger data governance frameworks. I think that's one of the main conversations that we're having right now, and I think that will only evolve. What those regulations will look like, I have absolutely no idea right now, but definitely more data regulations, maybe even open data laws or something like that. And also data sharing. And as Anastasia was saying, I do think that data sharing will be kind of core to the data world. And I do think like data sharing is teams where citizens are allowed to decide what data is shared from, like which of their own data is shared and with whom, like even with the government, with the private sector, for research or whatever, like more agency from the citizens, but also maybe governments being more open to data governance frameworks where citizen-generated data is considered also governmental data. And there's in the statistics community, they are actually creating frameworks for that, so that the statistics office can publish and use for statistical purposes citizen-generated data. We already seen that in the open data community with like institutions like the humanitarian OpenStreetMap world and things like that. But I do think that will only evolve into more citizen-generated data being kind of published in governmental portals. So I do think data sharing will be a big shift. As I was saying, even citizen-generated data and citizens being able to have more agency, but also how the public sector will share and use citizen-generated data. I do think that the evolution that we've seen on open data as far as thematic work will only go deeper, and I hope not siloed, because of course it's one of the challenges that the open data conversation starts to silo within its like their own communities. I do think that we should prevent that, but I do see a little bit of that going over there. I do think also that we will have more sandboxes or that type of kind of innovative way of understanding how open data, how data sharing, how data governance, the legal framework should be about. I do believe that it's a great idea, this idea of kind of testing it more before you kind of do a full implementation. So I do think that we will see through these 10 years until 2035, we will see a lot of those types of innovative ways of first testing out before a full implementation, as far as data governance, as far as open data, as far as privacy, as far as data frameworks and data sharing. I do think we will, as I said, these two velocities or these two paces. So we will see also kind of the usual open data portals, beacon portals being spread out through the world. But yeah, I will leave it there.
Great. Well, that gives us a lot to digest already. Thanks, Anastasia and Nati. So let's open the floor, because this is meant to also engage with the community.
Good day to everyone. My name is Eric van Ingen from Food and Agriculture Organization. I have a question on what are good business models to put out there when it comes to open data. And in very concretely, what I mean with it, how can we convince the private sector to produce more open data? And if you have any insights on that, I would love to hear. Thank you.
Good question. Nati, Anastasia, do you want to address that easy question from Eric? It's like the billion-dollar question in the space. Over to you, Nati. Or you're skipping this one?
I can only give my 2 cents, because it has been one of the most challenging conversations for the open data community, how to better connect with the private sector. and we haven't done a good job so far. A couple of years ago, actually, I was participating in an event organized by you guys, and there was this launch of the private sector open data initiative with Microsoft, Amazon, and a couple of other private, like huge private sector institutions publishing their data, and it was like data for good. And that was the first massive thing that I saw happening. But we still have, Eric, I don't have a proper answer for you yet. We have, I think there's still a lot of work to do to actually have a mature conversation with the private sector on how to better engage and how to promote open data from the private sector, as far as I'm concerned.
Anastasia, you want to? Yeah.
Perhaps to complement, because similar to Nati, yeah, indeed, it is a very open question, and yeah, we definitely do agree with Stefan that it is a super easy question to be addressed by us. But I would say that a couple of things which are happening at the moment, whereas I wouldn't see them to be a silver bullet, but first of them is a sort of culture. Because some businesses are not so very reluctant towards opening the data. Of course, it is rather an exception from the rule, not the rule itself, but anyways, so just promoting this culture, which might be made by those codes, including from the European Union. And actually, as far as I know, it is also sort of adopted rule, not the law or something like that, but rather the call for the action to make the reuse of the data more transparent, so that by definition, if we do use open data, we are not expected, considering the license attached to those data sets, we are not expected to refer to the original source that this particular data set have been used. Whereas from the study that the European Commission has performed, at some point they have realized that actually referring to the original data owner may create this sense of understanding that this has been something good made by them. But of course, when it comes to some voluntary things, it is of course not always the very generalizable practice. The second thing which is taking place in European Union, for instance, it is also, as far as I understand, somewhat compliant with what Nati mentioned, but in a bit broader context, is about those regulations, because currently in European Commission is either discussed or perhaps even adopted. I don't know this by heart at the moment, unfortunately. This act with regards to switch from this voluntary towards mandatory open sharing by data sharing by businesses, of course, under certain topics that have been identified to be important. So yeah, perhaps these two things. There is also referring back a bit towards that previous point, from which I will deviate a bit, just to pose a reference to another topic, that this referencing of the used data, which was not before considered by everyone who has used data, actually could be now even more important than before, because it not only demonstrates to those data publishers that actually the data that they are using are useful and these are used, but this also can contribute to a certain extent to accountability of artificial intelligence, when we can have an understanding of what have been used to produce certain insights we do obtain from those AI and generative AI models, that it has not been some random source, but it was rather a particular data set, whether it's open or public data set. I will be now hesitant towards using one or another term. And this in turn could contribute also directly or indirectly towards explainability and responsibility of artificial intelligence. But this is just with a reference to that and deviation from that point. Other than that, at the moment, better responses that we currently have as regards this either just the sense of belonging to the community and sharing this data, so just having this culture for one or another reason, and those mandatory pushes towards businesses to open data. Better answers will not come from me, but although these answers also cannot, of course, cannot be considered to be good ones.
Great, thanks so much. Barbara, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. A comment and a question for and thank you, this was excellent. So the comment was that I think from the many reasons that you both said in terms of challenges for the future, data governance will be a priority. And I think that this community has a big responsibility to make government see that it's not just about regulations. That's my comment. I think I'm preaching to the converted that I know in the call, but many others I don't know. And I think it's an important point. Second, you both mentioned the importance of the ecosystem in relation to a number of ecosystems, including citizens, the private sector, the academia. So maybe you want to share broadly with the broader participants what you have seen. So Anastasia, hi, nice to meet you. I know Nati quite well and the great work that the charter is doing. The challenges that you see, guys, in working with governments or helping governments understand that we need the effort of governments for that ecosystem to be nurtured, to be connected, to be created, because, you know, voices here and there exist in the ecosystem, but the government has a key role to play on that. So maybe you can share with us some of the either challenges you see or also maybe some good examples that you've seen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Barbara.
So thanks, Barbara. Nice to see you. I can delve on that. Coming from Latin America, I am actually part of one of the biggest and strongest open data communities that there is. I don't know if everybody here knows, but the Latin American open data community has had for over 12 years a regional open data conference and a conference every year. In the pandemic, we did it virtually, of course, but I was there for the first meeting where we were 80 people, and we were like, I don't know how many. Stefan, you were there in Brazil, 2000 last year. So it just keeps on growing and building like strong connections, even between government and civil society. It's like everybody is there. There's a conference and an unconference bit of it, and it's always government and civil society organizations from the host country organizing that event together. And we've been able to do that for 12 years in a row, only repeating a country once for the 10-year celebration. So Uruguay did the first one and the 10th, just like as a celebration. The connections, as I started with a kind of it with a joke, but it ended up being like super important. People interoperability is as important as data interoperability for this type of policies. We need to get together to discuss, to understand what everybody else is doing. You've just, Stefan and Anastasia, you've just been in an in-person event in Europe. Getting that connection, unfortunately, like we thought that Zoom could solve everything, but it doesn't. Getting in the same room together. And what we've seen in working with governments is sometimes getting the public officials together in the same room. They see that they're kind of both two ministries creating the same data set, and they didn't know us. So bringing people together is still very important for the implementation of open data policies. And as Barbara said, the community. I think there's a lot of governments that have already understood that you need, as we need to first understand the problem, we need to bring the data reusers into the conversation from the get-go to understand which problem we're trying to solve through the open data policy. And I do think that kind of there's already a lesson learned from that. Is every government bringing in the data reuse side in the conversation? No, but have we seen that being better? Yeah. And then of course it's part of what civil society organizations and journalists and universities need to do as far as advocacy, kind of work to get the governments to understand the added value of bringing everybody into the conversation. We saw that one of the examples that I like a lot is during COVID time. There was, I'm not going to point out a specific country, but it was in Latin America. They did government did a first publication of COVID-related data, and the quality wasn't good. And what civil society did was, of course, they said like out loud and through Twitter and everything, like this is not working. But the government was humble enough, and they had already built that bridge, and so they invited civil society to help kind of help get the quality of the data better and kind of address the challenges that civil society was bringing to the table. And they worked together, and then this country was one of the best publishers as far as COVID data was, because they collaborated.
Great. We have two more questions, and Gabby, over to you, and then Beverly.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And thanks, Anastasia, and to you for the excellent presentations. My question, so backdrop, perspective change, more of a sociology of quantification, and governance perspective, decision making. So just as a disclaimer for you to understand. Open data obviously has a supply and a demand side. And it seems that some institutions in the meantime say, listen, we have put the data out. It's quite heavy in terms of maintenance costs. And the uptake is not in a way that we had hoped. This is also what in part reiterated in your presentation. So question is, if when we say data, open data for citizens, we are not actually focusing on the usual CSOs, so civil society organizations, stakeholders, and that the citizens so far are left out of the equation here, so that open data not really benefits citizens. I would be interested in your perspective on that thought. And the other question regards synthetic data, which obviously for anyone reflecting on automated decision making is quite a concern, because it's a proxy danger in a way, right? Because it seems to create reality that due to missing data disaggregation creates a reality that might not reflect any type of societal reality. And although yes, we are on the governance side of it, and not, as Barbara said, heavy on the regulation, how do you see the need to regulate the creation and use of synthetic data in that regard? Thank you.
Great. I'll try to be quick. Thanks so much, Nati and Anastasia. I really appreciated your thoughts today. Nati, this question is for you. I was struck in your opening response on the things that the open data community learned about the disconnection between making data open and connecting to specific use cases or how data is being reused. I feel like we're starting to see some of those trends replicated again with the growth of digital public infrastructure. I'm curious what opportunities you see to pass on some of these lessons learned around ensuring that DPI, or whatever the latest buzzword is properly connected to citizen and user needs.
Great. Wonderful questions, and we could these questions we could have another hour to unpack those. Thanks so much for raising those questions. Anastasia, why don't we start with you?
I would refer to questions posed by Gabi, because indeed very, very good questions by me, although all of them were great, of course. So again, I do not have a silver bullet to propose, whereas from my experience that I have from Estonia, from Latvia, and from some more international collaborations, if we want to keep citizens in a loop, it is also something that Natalia has mentioned before. It is about building communities and building this interoperability. And in our case, in Latvia, for instance, it was about having those requests of the data processed very, very actively, so that the portal is equipped with a feature where the citizen or whoever else may request the data. Then there are loadings for this data. There are some analysis of where this data might be open, etc. And in some cases, this data might be open. And we also performed recently, together with colleagues of mine, an analysis of over 100 open data portals, and we realized that actually this feature is quite popular. But it was a Boolean analysis of whereas it exists, that doesn't exist, but whereas there are underlying processes, and actually this leads towards data opening. It is an open question. Another topic of ours, which we have explored, was with the reference to high-value datasets, because high-value datasets in part are expected to cover citizens' expectations, whereas in the current form, as by me, they are not. They are too generic, and they are seeking rather just interoperability and basic data availability among European Union member states. And as such, together with the colleagues of mine, we were considering on various it is possible to determine national nation-specific high-value data sets and what would be those inputs. Unfortunately, it is a very complicated topic, and as such, we have not achieved a very, very good answer, but we are talking about this. And thirdly,
I would stop you there. I would stop you there, Anastasia, because we're really sorry for that. Because anyway, but I would stop you on the high value because it relates to the question, Nati, about DPIs as well. And over to you.
Thank you so much. No, I just wanted to say, like, let's hack that conversation. Like, it's up to us. We need to be there. We need to be participating in the events. We need to be having the conversations with those implementing DPIs. We need to from the perspective, for example, of the Open Data Charter, where from the Open Data community, the Open Data implementations that we've seen in the past, we can add value to that. There's a strong connection because of the interoperability aspect of DPI. But as far as data governance, of course, data is the backbone of every DPI implementation. So let's see how we can bring our lessons and how we can be part of the conversation. So let's just hack that. Let's go to the events. Let's talk to the implementators.
Well, let's end with this call for hacking that Nati has provided us, which I think is a good way to stop here. So thanks so much, Nati. Thanks so much, Anastasia, for sharing your wisdom. Thanks, everyone, for being on this Fireside Chat. Lesson learned from this Fireside Chat is that an hour is never enough, but at least I hope it gives a teaser for coming back for the next ones as well. Thank you so much, and see you at the next one. Bye-bye.